Dementia presents a growing range of concerns today as Canada's population continues to age. Something that's often overlooked is that violent behavior can sometimes be a symptom of the condition. And while dementia patients are more often the victims of crime than the ones who commit them, there are those who will end up on the wrong side of the law. And here to help us understand the issues this presents, Graham Webb. He's a lawyer and executive director with the Advocacy Centre for the Elderly. Graham, good to have you here at TVO tonight.
Thank you, Steve.
This is an issue I don't think we know much about. So when did this first present itself on your radar screen?
On my radar would have been in 1985 when I began practicing law doing criminal defense work.
How common is it today?
Well, I think it's very common. It's certainly increasing because we have more seniors than we ever did before. And the profile of, I think, criminal defense work in general is shifting from fewer proportions of younger accused and higher proportions of older accused. Still fewer older than younger, but the proportion is shifting.
I'm not sure the justice system was set up with a view towards dealing with people with dementia who, I guess technically speaking, are violating the criminal code with various things that they may do. So I should follow up on that. How does the criminal justice system handle people who have done things that are illegal, but may have done them not of sound mind, as it were?
Well, there is an issue of criminal responsibility.
Right.
And so an older adult who's suffering from dementia might not be criminally responsible for their actions. It's not a foregone conclusion because there are people who have a moderate, mild dementia that they could still understand the nature and quality of their actions and bear criminal responsibility. There are others who don't, and ones who don't might be found guilty of an offense and then land up in the mental health criminal justice system.
I guess I'm wondering, does the criminal code provide for treating people who've committed crimes because of dementia differently than those who've done it of sound mind, as it were?
Oh, absolutely. Ontario court justices, Superior Court justices, and law enforcement across the country is aware of that issue. But the problem is that cases that don't really belong in the criminal justice system end up there for want of other resources. There's no other avenue available when there should be, because dementia is a health issue. And so violent tendencies that are associated as a symptom of dementia is a health and a healthcare issue. And many times these belong in the healthcare system, not in the criminal justice system.
Let's do a for instance here. So give me an example of something that had somebody who not had dementia done it, it would have been a clear crime, but if somebody with dementia does it, it ought to be considered in a different way.
Well, I can give you an example of one case I worked on. Was an older man who was living in the community with his wife, and he was having advancing dementia. This man had never had any criminal tendencies, probably didn't have a violent bone in his body, but as the dementia progressed, violent tendencies emerged, and the man was charged with an assault under the criminal code. Happened to be a domestic assault, and so it landed under all of the prosecutorial guidelines of prosecuting these crimes.
So just to understand, a domestic assault meaning he hit his wife?
He hit his wife.
Okay.
Yeah. And there was no doubt that this act had happened. The issue had been, is he criminally responsible or not? Now, Steve, for major crimes like a homicide, for example, or grave crimes where there'd normally be a penitentiary sentence, someone who's charged with a crime might be found criminally not responsible and end up in the criminal justice system at a psychiatric hospital for an indefinite period of time.
Is that option offered in the case of a dementia sufferer?
Well, it may be, because dementia can be contribute to a verdict of not criminally responsible. But people who are charged with crimes that don't normally attract custodial sentences or much less penitentiary sentences are very disadvantaged if they have to go into the criminal justice system indefinitely. There's a saying, when I did criminal defense law, you got to be crazy to plead insanity, And so this is the type of case where the man really didn't belong in the criminal justice system because it was a health issue and a health care issue. So he belonged in the long-term care home system.
And is that what happened?
Well, eventually, but in the meantime, the man was he would qualify for admission to a long-term care home. In Ontario, that's really like a nursing home or a home for aged, or elsewhere a personal care home perhaps. But no home would accept him while charges are outstanding.
Now, is that a practice or a law, or why does that happen?
It's a practice.
It's a practice. So if you've been charged with a crime, you cannot get into a long-term care facility.
Well, it's not really charged with a crime, but it's exhibiting violent tendencies. If you are someone who sets fires or has a history of physical or sexual abuse, then you might qualify for admission, because these are health care facilities. But the individual facilities are probably not going to accept the applicant, so the man has nowhere to go. So in this case, he ended up as a social admission to a regional hospital, and really occupied a hospital bed until we could get the chicken and the egg resolved, because he couldn't get the charges withdrawn until he had an appropriate long-term care admission, and he couldn't get the long-term care admission while the charges were outstanding.
Well, here's some facts that we should introduce to the debate as well. This is a new polling commissioned by the Ontario Council of Hospital Unions and the Canadian Union of Public Employees. And they are describing a situation of significant violence in long-term care. For example, 80% of those surveyed had experienced physical violence on the job. 63% said that they had faced sexual harassment at least once on the job. 43% said they had experienced sexual assault. Now, given numbers like that, if a person has violent tendencies, is putting them in a long-term care facility really the answer?
Yes, under certain circumstances. The circumstances are if the person is admitted to a specialized unit. Here in Ontario, we call them behavioral support units, where there are special training and facilities to care for demented persons with violent tendencies. It's not that we don't know how to care for these people. We've known that for a long time. The long-term care home industry is quite able to do that. But the problem is there are not enough behavioral support units and not enough behavioral support beds. And that's the problem, is that when there's dementia and violence, there is a waiting list for a behavioral support unit, but there's no waiting list for jail.
So we need more, no waiting list for jail, meaning they can be incarcerated much more easily than they can be found a place in a long-term care facility.
It's really the last resort. It's the no other option. At one time I represented an elderly man in his 80s. This man had a long-term same-sex relationship with another man. They were both very cultured, well-educated, really refined people who had no criminal tendencies and no violent tendencies, but they both developed dementia. And they lived in an upscale part of town in a rented apartment, and they reached the point where at certain times they would fail to recognize each other, and they became mutually assaultive. And the police were called on many occasions by neighbors and by the landlord, until finally the police felt they had no other alternative, but they had to arrest somebody. So they arrested my client, who was then in his 80s, and this man who had probably never had a parking ticket. I'm sure I'm exaggerating, but he had no experience with the criminal justice system, found himself in his 80s with dementia in the general prisoner population, which is quite young, going back and forth to the criminal courts in a paddy wagon. And
you don't want to see that.
Well, it's something you'd never want to see in your life. And eventually the man did get out of the criminal justice system and into the healthcare system where he belonged. But the healthcare system was not able to respond when it needed to. And the criminal justice, it fell to the criminal justice system to deal with the case that nobody else could handle, just to prevent injury. And that's fairly common. That's a common type of situation.
Well, let's finish up on this, Graham, because I presume with our population increasingly aging and with numbers of dementia sufferers increasing, this is something we're going to be seeing a lot more of in future. Is that fair to say?
That is absolutely fair to say, Steve. We need more of the right, appropriate facilities. We need more behavioral support units, more beds. We have less than 200 beds of behavioral support units across the province of Ontario, which is shockingly low.
Well, I know this has been on your radar screen for 35 years, but it's, I think, probably just recently on the radar screens of a lot of us. So thanks for bringing it to our attention.
Thank you.
That's Graham Webb, lawyer and executive director with the Advocacy Centre for the Elderly.
Thank you, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.